Okay, thank you. Well, first I want to tell you that I met Leo probably about 15 years ago, give or take. And we both worked at ASU, and Leo was the director of the Multicultural Center there. I believe that's the right title. Is that correct?
There's actually LGBTQ services.
Oh, okay. Can never get all those right, but thank you. And I was president of our LGBTQ staff organization at the time. So we did have a chance to work together a little bit there. And then here we are back again 15 years later, and it's really nice to be reconnected. Let me tell you a little bit about Leo. Leo, I'm not going to go into a long rendition because I want to give you a lot of time. For nearly 20 years, Leo's career in social work has been defined by an unwavering passion for advancing health, equity, and justice. Their background in health education, health policy, community mobilization, and advocacy through storytelling laid the groundwork for their work at the Colorado Health Foundation. With a PhD in social work from Michigan State University, Leo's academic research shined a light on the lived experiences of transgender and gender diverse individuals and allies, with a special focus on civic engagement as a catalyst for meaningful community change. Leo's favorite moments are spent exploring Colorado's breathtaking trails and sipping iced coffee at local cafes. A committed advocate and community builder, Leo views life as most fulfilling when it includes intentional connections with people, places, and pets. Please welcome Dr. Leo Kattari.
Thank you so much, Carol, and
Thank you.
thank you all for having me with you today. It's a pleasure to just spend a Saturday morning with folks who care about our communities and want to just see things be better for all of us. And so thank you for inviting me. When I got the call from Carol, I was like, I would do anything for you, Carol. So happy to be here. I do have a slide deck, and I promise it's not to make this formal. It's more to keep me on track and not talking too much. So I am going to share my screen in those slides. And again, it's not meant to like make this a really formal presentation because I'll get through these slides and then hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion. But just make sure I say what I want to say because I often forget. So I believe you all can see my screen now.
We can.
Perfect. I have double screens, and so I like to see everyone's faces too as I'm going through. So I'm gonna talk a little bit today about transgender justice and cross-movement solidarity and the importance for that collective action for justice because justice is intersectional and it impacts us all in different ways, and we all have to come together, particularly in this moment, to really see justice and equity flourish in our lifetime. And so a little bit more about me, and that was a beautiful readout of my bio. I'm Dr. Leo Kattari, just call me Leo, that's totally fine. My background is civic engagement and health equity research, including doing a lot of research about what motivates people to take action to improve their communities. And I did really interesting research with parents of trans kids to understand what motivates a parent to really come out and support their young person as a trans person and testify for state legislative hearings, for going through their school system or at doctors, and where does that come from and what motivates them so that we can spread that love and joy across the country. I'm a community organizer turned researcher, and so community-based research is really important to me. And my current job is at the Colorado Health Foundation, where I do public opinion research. That's both like quantitative polls. Yeah, that's great, wonderful. We love polls. And I also do more in-depth research around persuasive messaging and how do we speak to people's hearts and minds when we're talking about really controversial or emotional or charged topics like immigration, transgender issues, women's health, etc. I'm overeducated, we'll just put it that way. And so talking a little bit more about my positionality, I am a white transgender man, and so I was born female with my birth certificate still saying female. I should really update that to keep myself safe in our current climate. But you see, I present masculinely and I identify as a trans man. Um, I'm also middle class, live in Denver, Colorado, so West, Midwest, depending on who you talk to. Um, and all of this really informs the perspective that I bring to the work I do, and also limits the work I do because we all have our biases. And you know, and I can't I could work towards addressing them, but I can't always get rid of them. And so I just want to name and acknowledge that I too have biases in my own work. And the lens that I bring to my work also says I have an agenda of my work. And that's okay too, because my agenda is health equity and justice. If you all real quickly in the chat can just share your name, your pronouns, where you call home. And then because things are so intense lately, I would love to just center a little bit of joy on our Saturday morning together and just one thing that made you smile this past week. And as you're sharing that, so I get to know you all a little bit, I'll share you with my moment of joy. My moment of joy is with my two dogs. So we have our routines, and yesterday it was way too hot to go for a walk during the day, and I was going to take them for a walk in the evening. It was also too hot, and so one of my dogs was very upset for the routine interruption. We were sitting on the couch, and she was just like staring at me, waiting for me to take her for her walk. And it wasn't like an aggressive stare. It was just like a I'm waiting. It's time. And I was just like, you're really cute and you bring me a lot of joy. So thank you for sharing your moment of joy with me as well. I think we need to really honor those moments we have together. Other things I want to do before we kick this off, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but I do want to do a land and labor acknowledgement. We do in the US and North America live on stolen land that belong to indigenous and native communities. I want to honor that that legacy of genocide and violence lingers today. I also want to do a um, a labor acknowledgement, and I have actually the words written down that I'm going to find. Um, you know, I want to recognize and acknowledge that the labor upon which our country, our states, and our institutions are built. We remember that our country is built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the US from the African continent. And I want to recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We also want to acknowledge immigrant labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples who contributed to the building of our country and continue to serve within our labor force. And we also acknowledge the so much unpaid caregiving labor that particularly women do in our country that really keeps our country moving forward. With that, I will move into some other shared commitments and expectations, just so we have some grounding of our time together. Number one is I hope you lead with curiosity and lean into discomfort, both about yourselves as well as others in our room today, and grant yourself and everyone else, as well as me, permission to make mistakes and missteps, right? The stuff is hard and changing all the time, and that's okay. But our curiosity and our intentions are what kind of keep us grounded. I want to hold space for intersectionality and the many ways that our identities and lived experiences bring so much value to the work we do and to the conversations we have together. And then also, this is also a space where we can question and counter systems of oppression and harmful power that impacts all of our lives that we're seeing play out a little too concretely right now. So with that, I'm going to go into kind of more information. Again, I want to keep this short, but really I'm sharing this to prompt questions so that we can have a really good dialogue later. So we already did our introduction. I'm going to start with a word on words and just talking a little bit about language and terms, talk a little bit about our current political moment that we're in, then shift to that cross-movement solidarity and how important that is right now, and then again, spend lots of time for questions. So a word on words. There are so many terms and words and language used to describe transgender and gender diverse communities. And it's changing all the time. As a trans person and also someone who studies and researches with transgender, gender diverse communities, I don't know all the terms and I mess it up. often. And so I think we often get stuck in the perfection of language and words. And I am asking us to not get stuck in the words themselves, but to really focus ourselves on how do we create spaces where everyone's rights are respected and everyone's dignity is upheld. You'll hear me talk about transgender and gender diverse, or the acronym I use is TGD because I'm an academic and I love acronyms. And even with me using transgender and gender diverse, I get pushback for using those terms, that they're not inclusive enough, that it doesn't include non-binary folks. And so I often have to explain when I say transgender, gender diverse, I use that as an umbrella term to capture as much of the trans and non-binary and gender diverse community as possible. And there's no way you can do that. I also want to note that I'll be using the term cisgender to just define folks who are not transgender or gender diverse. And that's simply what cisgender means. I love a good visual. And so this is from research through the Pew Research Center, where I actually led some of these focus groups with trans masculine folks around like, what are the terms that transgender people use to define themselves? What are the terms that non-binary folks use to describe themselves? And then what's like the crossover? And you'll see words like trans, transgender, and queer kind of bring everyone together in the shared common language. However, there's also distinct language that folks use. So again, you never know what terms someone's going to use for themselves. And it's a great opportunity to engage in discussion, to say, you use the term non-binary. What does that mean to you? You use trans. What does that mean to you? Because each word is going to mean something different to each individual, and their experience as a trans person or a non-binary person is going to look different. I have another visual to kind of describe what I was just talking about. Many transgender and non-binary people do consider themselves as transgender. Some trans people do not consider themselves non-binary, but some trans people do. And so I'm kind of an example of this, where maybe I express, you see me and you think man, masculine, yet I use he and they pronouns. And you'll often see me maybe like paint my nails or wear colors that are often assumed to be feminine, like pink and purple and things like that. And my gestures are actually also considered very feminine, right? So I'm trans and somewhat non-binary, but I usually stick with the term trans man as a way to, especially my storytelling work, to make it simple. But gender is never simple. And then you'll see that some non-binary people use the term transgender to describe themselves, and some people do not use the term trans or transgender, right? And so maybe they feel like they're part of the trans community and maybe they don't. And again, we never know how folks are defining themselves and describing themselves and where their sense of belonging comes from, unless we ask with honest and good intentions, right? These are conversation starters. And a great way to do that is to share like, hey, my name is Leo. I use he and they pronouns. What's your name? What are your pronouns? And that's just an opener. Another question I get asked often is how many people are actually like transgender and gender diverse? And unfortunately, our data systems are awful. And we don't know, and we can't separate transgender from non-binary, but we can generally say that somewhere between 0.5% and 1.5% of the population fall under the transgender umbrella. I really appreciate the Williams Institute because it kind of gives us a little bit more information about like, well, who's trans women, who's trans men, and who's non-binary. And so about a quarter of people who say they belong to the trans community say they are non-binary. And then the range of young people, so under the age of 18, who identify as transgender, gender diverse is almost twice as much, sometimes 3 or 4 times, depending on the study. Whereas could be 1.4% all the way up to, some research has gone all the way up to 8.4%. So we do know that more younger generations are identifying somewhere under the trans umbrella and are more likely to identify as gender diverse or non-binary. So kind of resisting the binary of gender. I also kind of wanted to talk a little bit about gender affirming care, especially because there was a big Supreme Court case this week. And I want to talk about like what is gender affirming care? Because I think a lot of people go right to surgeries, and that's such a small percentage of what gender affirming care really is. So I like to think of gender affirming care in three different ways. There's social gender affirming care, there's medical gender affirming care, and then there's legal gender affirming care. Social are things like the clothes you wear, your hairstyle, your name and pronouns, how you want people to refer to you. Um, Medical is things that we typically go to and where the right really wants us to think about, where a big part and probably the most access part of gender affirming medical care is talk therapy. Most trans folks who want to receive other forms of medical care actually have to start with some kind of therapy, and that's required by insurance. There's also puberty blockers, which are 1,000,000% reversible and have little to no side effects. And really, it's exactly what it does. It blocks puberty. And this essentially gives young people and their parents and families more time to think about, is more gender affirming medical care needed or not? Um, and as soon as you stop puberty blockers, you go through the puberty in which your biological sex, if you are male or female, intersex, you might not know what puberty you will go through. And if you choose to not go through your regular body puberty, you could take hormone therapy and go through a different puberty. And then there's also surgeries. I do want to say that when it comes to research of young people, cisgender and trans, that cisgender boys or men are so much more likely to access gender affirming care as a young person for, I can't pronounce this word, gynecomastia, where like cisgender men develop breast. And so young men are more likely to get top surgery to remove their breasts than transgender men and women. So gender affirming care is for people of all genders, including cisgender folks. And then the last form of gender affirming care is legal care, where most likely you're trying to make sure your identity documents match the gender you are, or you express yourself. So like for me, I'm traveling internationally in a couple of weeks, and I want to make sure that my passport picture looks exactly like I do now, which it doesn't, unfortunately, because I've lost a lot of weight, and I'm like, oh God, I'm going to get flagged, and nervous about what that happens. But having your identity documents in alignment is actually a big safety issue for many trans people. Other things about gender affirming care, just some myths I want to dispel. There's been over a century of research on gender affirming care. A lot of the initial research was done in Germany in the earlier part of the 20th century and got destroyed during Nazi Germany. But in the 1950s and 60s, research started up again. And so there's incredible amounts of research about gender affirming care and how it is and improves your health outcomes for youth and adults. All credible medical and health associations support gender affirming care and have statements in support of gender affirming care. And we know that trans youth, when they receive gender affirming care, they are more likely to have similar health outcomes as cisgender peers, and sometimes have even better health outcomes than their cisgender peers just by receiving gender affirming care, which is usually for young people that social model of gender affirming care, where being affirmed in their name and their pronouns and their what they can wear and what they and being like respected in school for the gender they are. Sometimes it includes puberty blockers and hormone therapy. So to that point, gender affirming adults matter so much to young people. And family members, and in particular parents who are affirming, is the #1 protective factors for the mental health of trans kids. Simply using a trans kid's chosen name could really just improve their mental health dramatically. Removing trans kids from gender affirming homes will cause emotional and physical distress and increases the risk of suicide for those young people. Some medical providers argue that not being affirming is a form of child abuse, whereas we hear the right say the opposite, that being an affirming parent is a form of child abuse. But actually, based on the data we know, not being affirming is actually really harmful, and that is directly child abuse. And then parents and healthcare providers often work together to decide what is best for a child. And this is where we say politicians are not healthcare providers. They should stay out of the doctor's office. They shouldn't be making these decisions. And then the last piece of like political controversy that we hear often is transgender youth in sports. And so I want to focus this on bans deprive trans youth of the benefits of sports, particularly team sports, but even solo sports like tennis or golf. We do have research that shows that young people participation in sports will lower depression and suicidality, create a sense of belonging and self-empowerment, and improve academic performance. And don't we want all young people to experience those things? Research also shows that when you have trans-inclusive sports, this is comparisons of states with bans for trans youth to participate in sports, and then sports with states without sports bans for trans kids. One, we see that these bans focus on transgender women or transgender girls, so young people who transition from male to female. And so it's already sexist and misogynistic, these policies, because they're one, ignoring men because patriarchy, and two, really focusing on feminine folks and victimizing feminine folks. But these sports bans or the having trans girls on sports teams, there's no evidence of harm. There's no decrease in participation among cisgender girls. And there's absolutely no evidence of outperformance. In fact, the many parents I talk to, the way they talk about their young trans girl in sports is they're like, they love playing basketball, but they are so terrible at it. And 9 times out of 10, that's what I hear is that they love the sport, but they're really bad at it. And I'm like, at least you're supporting them playing sports ball. And these policies can lead to really intrusive, sexist, and racist enforcement. And there's a state, I feel like Oklahoma or Arkansas, one of those states around there, where they yesterday, I think the federal court is letting them do like genital checks on young people, essentially. Right, super intrusive. And then we also know that when we are challenging the way people look when they're playing sports, this is also really racist. And we see that there can be a lot of alienation of young Black girls' participation in sports when we start saying, you don't look this way, or you're so good at this, you must have too much testosterone in your body, and things like that. And so these are really actually harmful policies that harm cisgender girls as well as transgender girls. And then I just wanted to show the map of the US, where most of the US is not a safe place for transgender and gender diverse people right now. I happen to live in Colorado, so I'm in one of the sanctuary states. But you'll see that there's not many of those dark green states. Most states are red. And that's sad. And this is from the Movement Advancement Project. They do a really great job tracking policies around LGBTQ plus communities and also around democracy. They gotten into the democracy game. So if you want to know about how like voting rights are being dismantled, MAP or Movement Advancement Project is a great resource for that. Okay, so kind of connecting the dots between cross movement solidarity. I made a visual, I'm a visual learner, I mentioned that before, but there's so many movements where there is crossover that and they're intersectional, and they also advance women's rights as well. And so thinking about the transgender, gender diverse justice, reproductive justice, disability justice, and immigrant justice. And I'm sure there's like there's so many more movements we can add to this, but these are the four I want to focus on. There's so much overlap between them, and they all focus on historically marginalized communities. They are all anchored in bodily autonomy and self-determination and being able to make decisions for ourselves. They're all intersecting identities where you could be trans and Black and disabled, and seek reproductive health care and need an abortion, right? You could be undocumented and disabled, right? They're all intersectional. And so we all have to work together, so that we all have access to equity and justice. Um, they all advocate for health equity in some way, whether it's access to care, that bodily autonomy, or discrimination in healthcare settings, because most of them fight discrimination and bias in some way. There's a lot of shared opponents in political attacks, as you all know. There's intertwined legal battles, so abortion bans impact transgender care, gender affirming care bans impact abortion care. And when we talk about who gets criminalized with documents, right, that impacts trans people and impacts immigrants and undocumented folks, or even documented immigrants and refugees are being impacted by this criminalization of place and bodies, as well as disabled folks as well. And so there's shared systems of oppression, that this is where I get really wonky, and I'll share this with this group, these words, but that are rooted in white supremacy and colonization and patriarchy, right? That the harm done to women, cisgender and transgender, to immigrants, to disabled folks, to folks seeking abortion is all rooted in patriarchal white supremacy and colonization. And it takes a lot of work to undo all of that, which makes our jobs a lot harder. When I do messaging work, I talk a lot about it's really easy to invoke fear from people, where you make immigrants enemies, you make trans people enemies, but to build empathy and compassion, you have to like calm the reactionary emotional place and then have people think rationally. So the job is twice as hard. So our job is twice as hard, but we can do it because we've done it in the past. We're going to do it again, and we're going to have to keep doing it. Hopefully not forever, but for our lifetime, probably. Okay, so all of that was to spark questions. With this, I just want to end with an Audre Lorde quote, and say, in our world, divide and conquer must become define and empower. And I think our discussion today is all about define and empower. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I open it up to questions, and hope we can have a really great dialogue.
And then I'm gonna
Thank you.
turn the
Yes,
stop recording.
right.